The conference, or the speech we will listen to now, is entitled Cognition and Emotions in Our Brain. What can we expect from neuroscience in terms of education, languages, and culture? Linguist Bruno Della Chiesa has been trained at the universities of Bonn and La Sorbonne. He's lived in Egypt, Mexico, Austria, and is currently living in the USA. He defines himself as a busy cosmopolitan. He speaks and reads in English, French, German, and Spanish. Between 1999 and 2008, he founded and led a project on brain research and learning sciences at the OECD Center for Research and Innovation in Education. He is considered as one of the main founders of neuroscience in education, and since 2008, he's been a professor at the University of Harvard. As a result of his academic activities and his research work in recent years, he has created and led the Globalization Languages program. He's established quite a few theories about the tesseracts in our brain. His books have been translated to more than 6 languages. In Bruno Della Chiesa's own words, the brain learns continuously, and that means we can learn a language at any age. And besides, he was telling us yesterday that if this learning is associated with positive emotions, a reward system is activated in the brain, which helps in terms of motivating ourselves and therefore in terms of achieving success. So let us not despair. We still have the time.
Join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Bruno Della Chiesa.
Thank you very much. Otra vez, hoy voy a intentar algo.
Again, I'll do my best to do something dangerous, which is presenting everything in Spanish, or rather in Castilian. As I did yesterday, I would like to present in Basque, but I didn't have the time to get ready and learn the language within 24 hours. Perhaps one day, and since we can learn at any age, and we can learn anything, even when you're about 50, and even when we bear in mind that Basque has its reputation for being a very difficult language to learn, it is not impossible that one day I learn the language from this region. Anyway, let us continue what we started yesterday. Perhaps with not as many jokes as I told yesterday, because we don't have the time, and perhaps with some additional considerations. So, dear friends, dear future enemies, these are some words from my old friend Noam Chomsky. I will not translate because I'm a horrible translator. I'm really bad at doing those things. But this is what we will be talking about within the next hour. So, cognition and emotion in our brains, languages and cultures around and within the brain. Part 2. So, this is our learning journey, stage 2. We'll keep moving with this huge balloon that you see on the image. As I said yesterday, the good thing is that with a balloon like this, you know exactly where you start, but you don't know where you're going to because you have to rely on the winds. And the winds today are our brains in this room. For the colleagues that were not here yesterday, This was an image I used in the presentation, differences in point of view. And about connecting points. As a definition or as a metaphor of understanding. Understanding, comprehending, is about putting points together, connecting points together. In an isolated way, they make no sense whatsoever, but when connected, they bring an image up. They make sense. In my own definition, this is about transforming information into knowledge. We'll see how we can use that in a minute. Not knowing is bad, but not wanting to know is even worse, as they say in Africa. Let us see. Cheer up. In any business, in any walk of life, it is always healthy to try and open a question mark on those things that we considered as acquired. The menu yesterday, there was something that I wanted to rescue from yesterday in order to use it again. As I said yesterday, 15, 16, 17 years ago, when I started my project at OECD, the BRAIN project, as it has been called, there was a lack of interest, an amazing lack of interest everywhere. Luckily, we did have the support of 5 countries. There's something interesting about OECD. A majority of international organizations share something, and OECD is part of that. It's like an animal farm from George Orwell. All animals are equal, all countries are equal, but there are some countries which are more equal than others. For example, when I joined the project in 1999, I was told that I was going to start a project about brain and about learning. There was 1 year of preparation, and then I was supposed to present to the member states. And I was told that I needed a unanimous agreement. I argued, you must be joking. How can you reach consensus with 30 countries around the table? And they said, oh, don't worry, it's just 2 you need, really. 2 out of 30. That is not my definition of consensus. Oh, not to worry. If you have the support of just 2 member states out of 30, that's enough. Provided these 2 countries are the US and Japan. If you have the US and Japan, that's it. Unanimous agreement. If you have Luxembourg and Iceland on board, so, as I was saying, we were lucky 15 years ago that we had the full support of 5 countries. It was enough because we had the US, we had Japan, the UK, Finland, and Spain. At that time, Spain, one of the countries that supported the project right from the start, this crazy project. It was a crazy project, I can assure you. But it seems to me that in some countries at least, back then, 16 years ago, people had a taste for crazy things. Right from the beginning, we started organizing conferences, also here in Spain. The problem is now that 15, 16 years onwards, that lack of interest that we had at the beginning has become a fashionable trend. This is a problem because now we have new categories of colleagues, new categories of human beings, neuroaddicts. These are people in the world of education, or citizens in general, human beings in general, that believe that neuroscience will resolve every single problem in education. I'm very sorry to say that that is not the case. Now, neuroscience, or any type of science, will be unable to resolve any type of problem, any type of problems. It is not the role. It is not what they're there for. And I'll show you in a minute. The problem is that you have neuro addicts. In some countries you have more than in others. And as a consequence, there's another category of people, neurocharlatans. Neurocharlatans are people that, generally speaking, know nothing about neuroscience, and yet they sell stories that are, in theory, as they say, based on their knowledge of the brain. They know nothing of the brain, but they sell stories about it. The important thing is selling. So we have to be careful. We have to be very careful, because that can be very dangerous. And then we have neurodealers or neurotraffickers. Neurocharlatans don't even know what they're talking about. But neurotraffickers or neurodealers sometimes know really well what they talk about. Not always. It is not incompatible that they belong to the two categories at the same time. But neurotraffickers or neurodealers use the results of scientific research to justify political choices or political decisions, and the adoption of educational practices which follow a hidden political or ideological agenda. And that is very easy to foster, especially when you talk about science, which is somewhat difficult to access. We have to be aware of the fact that most people know nothing about neuroscience, and that makes sense. No problem with that. Now, if someone in this room asks me if it is possible to justify any horrible thing, such as, for example, ethnic segregation in schools based on neuroscience, I find it unbearable. But that's the situation around us. Not because neuroscience tells us that ethnic segregation or segregation based on any type of thing is a good thing, but we have to bear in mind that results can be twisted, can be manipulated in such a way that you can make any statement about anything. There was a colleague of ours yesterday who told us about a new category, the neurohijackers. These guys are very interesting human beings that usually work for ministries of education in different countries. I'm sorry, but it is true. I'm not talking about Spain. Of course not. But I've seen in some cases very strange things. And they work together. They get together, consciously or unconsciously, willingly or unwillingly, with neurocharlatans and neurodealers, in order to support, justify their political options. We have a very interesting example now in the UK. A British politician who justifies, inverted commas, a selection of a certain reading mechanism, a reading methodology based on so-called neuroscientific findings. The problem is that the neuroscientific findings that he uses are only part of a statement that is part of an abstract that belongs to an article, to a paper. The colleague that published the paper in the US saw the quote and said that even if you read the complete abstract and not just 2 or 3 lines out of it, even if you take the full abstract, blah, 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 there is a statement there saying, however, all that has disappeared miraculously from this statement in order to justify, in order to try and make some sense out of an educational policy, which is a political decision. It has nothing to do whatsoever with science. We've talked about neuromyths and neurolegends. The left lobe, the right lobe, that's why we fight, that's why we struggle. We use 10% of our brain. For the brain, all important things happen before we get to the age of 3, and all that rubbish. The problem is that still nowadays, and in some countries more than in others, these neurolegends or neuromyths are still considered by a majority of people as the revealed truth, so to say. In the US, it is absolutely amazing, amazing. Naturally, we're talking about a country where a majority of people believe that the world was created in 7 days. Lots of people still think that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2013 or 2003. And a lot of people believe that we are the most important country, the most extraordinary country in the history of humankind. A majority of the local population in the US believe in things like this, so you can expect anything from them. Neuromyths are very strong in some countries, especially in the US, but not only in the US. Develop and survive due to a very simple reason. It is poor communication between two sides, the scientific world and citizens. And that includes people in the world of education. And where does that bad communication come from? Well, it's rather easy to explain. You don't have a pointer? Okay, you can see it on the slide. When you need to make a decision, excellent, fantastic. Excellent organization. I'm stunned. No, seriously. So, when we talk about making decisions that affect society as a whole, especially in terms of education, we're talking about the future, because it's our children we need to cater for, the children of our children, the future of humankind, and perhaps the future of a planet. Everything has to do with ethics and politics. In theory, in accordance with what Plato used to say, you pronounce it Platón in Spanish, don't you? Political decisions follow ethical decisions. No, there is a judgment, an ethical judgment. That is right, that is wrong. So, in general, there is nothing 100% right or wrong. There is an axis, and you move towards either extreme, right or wrong. And from there, in theory at least, you develop policies and politics which belong to the axis of desirable and undesirable. Politics and political measures can be considered along a feasible, non-feasible axis. Okay? And based on that, you develop educational policies on an effective, non-effective axis. This is the process for deciding and implementing what we implement in our educational systems. I call it a cascade. Okay? It's like a cataract. Science, any type of science, has nothing to do, or very little to do with that. Or at least it is not directly related. Why? because science develops on an axis that tells you whether it's accurate or non-accurate. Science never can tell us what we need to do. Science never has to play that role. If we have learned anything from the 20th century, we know where we can get if we apply our policies based exclusively on scientific considerations, whether they're right, whether they're wrong. Science cannot, must not replace ethics. The problem is that what we are learning about anything, in this case the human brain, can help us make decisions, but not tell us what to do. Science can shed light on what we do, a new light into everything we need to think about. I said this yesterday already, but let me say it once again, because not all of you were in the conference yesterday. Never before have we tried in educational neuroscience to replace other scientific disciplines, especially social disciplines, educational sociology, conventional sociology, and obviously the philosophy of education. It is not about replacing. It is about adding one more light so that we can understand better what is happening around us. Now, ethics, as anything else in the human brain, is the result of emotions and cognition, ideas, philosophy, in an axis which goes from true to untrue. Also in science. The problem is that in order to communicate the findings from the world of science, or connecting the world of science with the world of citizens, the world of politicians, the world of decision makers, and the world of teachers, we need to go through an intermediate channel, which is that of the media. And that intermediate channel is not capable of translating scientific findings in an adequate way for proper understanding on the side of citizens. That is a problem. And it's not just that media are incapable of doing that properly. They probably don't want to do that. There's a number of reasons I could explain that. We can talk about them. Sometimes it is even worse. They are unable to do it, and they are not aware that they are unable. All of that and other things are part of a basic textbook that I hope is still adequate, The Understanding of the Brain, which I published with my colleagues from the OECD 8 years ago. Chinese, Spanish, English, French, Arabic, amongst other languages. If you're interested in this book, well, it's a bit old, I know. But to us, educators in general, as I see it, through the opinions of some of our colleagues, it is still a suitable approach, a suitable introduction to our understanding of the human brain, a brain which is capable to learn throughout our entire life. If you're interested in that, I will give you my contact details at the end of my presentation. You can send me an email, and I can send you a copy of the book in Spanish, in English, or in any language you're interested in a PDF format. In any case, I know the paper copies are out of stock, are out of print. But it is very easy to handle it using a PDF. Now, let's talk about languages, because I promised we would do it. just that. Let's talk about motivation. Motivation is always the result of forces that are emotions, positive and negative. So let me tell you very quickly about the motivation to learn languages and to get familiarized with different cultures. Two things that are intimately related to each other. Remember this? The Tower of Babel. In accordance with the book of Genesis, chapter 11, at that time, we had a planet where only one language was spoken, where the same words were spoken. And since we are not in the US, there is no problem in saying that this doesn't correspond to any historical truth. Quite likely, there was never a point in time during which there was only one language. Perhaps Basque. But that's very special. Anyway, that doesn't mean that this statement from the Bible makes no sense. The book of Genesis is not a historical book. It is not a scientific textbook. It doesn't give us answers about questions like how, but to questions like why. It is a meditation, a poetic, a religious meditation, but it is not scientific. It is something deeper or more profound, or something that goes beyond science itself. So let us see what sense we can make out of this. In order to start with this debate, I have a lot of examples, but I cannot show you all of them. There is a very big role played whenever we want to learn a language, when we are a child or a young adult or an adult. Perceptions and representations of the human group that speaks a language play a very important role in our learning of the language. We can hear things like, oh, this language is very tough or very rough. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There are no rough languages as such. Poetry exists in every single language on earth. There is no such thing as a rough language. When people say, and this is something that we can hear often in France, German is a rough language. People who say that do not refer to the language or to the phonetics of the language. They refer to the historical recollection of negative emotions that have to do with the own representation of the people that speak that language. A very quick example. In Finland, they have organized, they have set up a research program putting together school children from the whole country. They asked the students about their favorite subject. And all children, all adolescents, compiled a category of things they had in mind. And then they put together all the results. Fantastic. Number one, right at the top, English. Then, after an empty gap, most of all other subjects, very close to each other, mathematics, physics, history, geography, whatever. Then a huge empty gap, and right at the bottom, Swedish and Russian. A language right at the top, and 2 or 3 languages right at the bottom. What is the difference in there? Why such a difference? Well, the main difference, as I know, is that Finland has never had a war against an English-speaking country. They have problems with their neighbors, as everyone, as any human group. So the perception of Russians or Finns or Swedes is not as good. It is us against them, those over there.
Es fundamental
It is essential.
para aprender
In order to understand, in order to learn a language successfully, okay,
si no tengo una
unless
representación
I have
positiva,
a positive representation of the human group that uses that language,
no voy a
I will not succeed.
conseguirlo. Pues.
I will not make it.
Estas representaciones y percepciones
These perceptions, these representations are the essential building blocks of motivation for individuals at any age. And motivation, obviously, has a huge role on the results that we can achieve and about the consequences in the real world of our learning a language.
consecuencias, por ejemplo, consecuencias muy concretas, ¿no?
Very specific consequences
Es un poco utilitarista
to
lo
start
que voy a
with.
decir.
I know it may sound a bit utilitarian, but
Es algo que probablemente aquí también
it is interesting.
se puede entender, se puede ver, se
I
puede
think it is
observar.
relatively easy to understand, to see every day. 30 years ago,
Cuando yo buscaba un
when I was looking for a job
trabajo en Francia,
in France or in Germany,
tenía entrevistas con
I had interviews
actores potenciales.
with potential recruiters.
Y yo he dicho, pues, hablo inglés.
And I used to say, I speak English.
Ah, qué bueno.
Everyone's reaction was, good. Now,
Mis hijos,
my
mi
children,
hija, mi hijo,
or my daughter, my son,
30 años después,
30 years on,
también las mismas entrevistas.
have the same interviews.
Hablo inglés.
And they say, I speak English. And the answer is, yes, of course, naturally. And from then on,
Tenemos ahora,
we now have
desde el punto de vista muy utilitarista,
a very utilitarian point of view, which is not the essence of what I'm about to say, but
un desarrollo.
we have seen a development, an incredible development. We've moved from a world
Hablar inglés
where speaking English was a major advantage
mercado laboral,
in the labor market, that's how you say that,
mundo en lo cual no hablar inglés
to
es
a
una
world
desventaja.
where not being able to speak English is a disadvantage.
Además, entre nosotros tenía
And
un
between you
acuerdo
and
con mis
me,
hijos desde el inicio. He dicho
I've had an agreement with my children.
que al menos
I wanted
serían
children that are trilingual, at least.
lengua de las
French,
madres,
because it is the language of mothers.
inglés porque
English,
de todos modos, ¿no? Para sobrevivir.
because you need it to survive in
Y
this
la
world.
tercera lengua
And the
será
third language could be
lo que quieren.
whatever they want.
Hasta mi primera visita a China.
Until I first visited China.
Regresando de China, he llamado a mis dos
Coming back from China, I called my two
niños,
children,
niños pues, adolescentes.
well, children, adolescents at that time.
Cambio de programa.
And I said, change of roadmap. It is now about being quadrilingual. 4 languages. English and French are okay. Now Mandarin Chinese
Como se dice, mandarín, es la tercera lengua,
is the third language,
otra.
and another one, whatever.
Porque para mi generación,
Because for my generation, not speaking Chinese,
necesariamente un
well,
problema.
not a big deal.
En el mundo que viene,
In the world coming,
diferente.
things will change.
Lo siento, pero es así.
I'm sorry, but that's the case.
Al menos vamos a cambiar la lengua franca.
At least our lingua franca will change. We'll see how the Chinese will behave.
Lo que pasa es que las percepciones y
What is
representaciones
happening
de
is
la
that the
alteridad
perceptions and
de nosotros,
representations
de los demás,
of the
de los de
others,
allá, como
of the
he dicho,
rest, of those over there,
aparece desde el inicio de la vida. En la familia,
is in our brain right from the beginning of our life, in the environment around us.
el niño llega a la educación formal, a
When
la escuela,
children get to formal teaching, when they get to school, they already have a very strong representation of the different human groups around them,
del grupo propio.
around their own group.
Es decir, es bastante tarde.
That means it is
Y también
rather late
porque
already,
representaciones
because representations
que vienen de la familia y del
that
entorno
come from the family and from the closest environment
reforzadas
are generally reinforced by the early influence of communication media.
se puede representar eso de esta manera, un vortex.
In that way, we can have a vortex that can be positive or negative.
Traducir
I'm
esto
sorry I
este
didn't translate the slide. It is too complicated,
el equipo necesario para eso.
and I don't have the necessary resources, but this is the idea.
Si al inicio
If right at the start, a child or even an adult
positiva del outgroup,
has a positive representation of the others, of those over there, it is very likely that motivation will be positive and learning will go up that way. It's like a positive vortex going up. If the representation of the others is negative, it is very likely that they will develop downwards, a negative vortex. But you can imagine such a negative vortex very easily. Now, it is not just the labor market we're talking about. The picture is much bigger, as we know. Learning a language, being in direct or indirect contact with a different culture, is something that plays a huge role for the identity of human beings, for the development of the brain of human beings. Let us see if we have tesseracts. I'll explain that. Do we have tesseracts in our brains? Just to start, perhaps the font is too small, but not to worry. I can send you additional material for those of you contacting me. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German writer, said the following: whoever doesn't speak foreign languages knows nothing about their own language. It is a dangerous word. Goethe, as a man that was careful with politics, didn't have the courage to publish this during his life, so it was a post-mortem statement. It is provocative, of course. To a monolinguist, to someone who speaks only one language, they know about their own language, of course, but bilingual people or multilingual people know perfectly well what Goethe was referring to. And this is what we are about to see quickly. In order to present this at Harvard with my PhD students, I need 36 hours. But here in Bilbao, I've seen lots of extraordinary people who said 10 minutes is enough. As I said before, I can send you additional comments with the statement, the layers and everything. Okay. This is about geometry, really. For some people, this is very useful. For some people, this adds complication. If it adds complication, don't you worry. It's about basic geometry. Here we're talking about a space with dimension 0, dimension 1, dimension 2, dimension 3. In a space of dimension 0, we're talking about a dot. Dimension 0 is a dot. Dimension 1 is a line. Okay? Dimension 2 would be a plane. Now we can imagine with two-dimensional figures like a square or like a circle. And dimension 3, well, a 3D. That's how you call it, yeah? It is a universe where we live. Okay. When we talk about learning, again, I'm sorry I didn't translate this slide because it's too complex. Not impossible, but I would need a specialist. I would need a software that I don't have. Anyway, dimension 0, a point in geometry, would equate to what I call information. Okay? Dark clouds that have no meaning by themselves. That would be dimension 0. Dimension 1 in learning would be what I call knowledge. As I said before, connecting dots is about transforming information into knowledge. It is about combining, connecting the different dots so that we arrive at an image that makes sense. Dimension 2 in learning would be what in English is called skills. I'm not sure about the word in Spanish. Right, that's the word in Spanish. Thank you. 2 more days in Spain, and my Spanish will be amazing. It will return to me. But it's difficult to me. I haven't spoken Spanish for a long time, and I'm an old man. So, skills. And dimension 3 in learning would be know-how. Know-how? You say it like that? Okay. When we talk about languages, it is very interesting to realize the following. We have dimension 0, the minimum unit, which is the sounds and the letters. We combine sounds, we combine letters, following certain rules in morphology, in phonetics, reaching dimension 0, where we arrive at words. And by combining words, we reach dimension 2, sentences, that are combined using syntax rules or syntactic rules. And then, finally, we combine statements, we combine sentences, so that we can have a narrative or a discourse. Our ancestors, in the caves where they lived, had no idea about sounds, letters, symbols, let alone sentences. At the start, there was the narrative. Then, there was an analysis of that narrative, an analysis of the language, to split it into the different elements. And exactly the same applies to culture. Dimension 0 would have the facts, or the perception we have of the facts. You get to a country, you don't know. You get to a culture, you don't know. You can see, you can hear, you can perceive things. Elements of that culture, but what do they mean? Nothing. It is the perception of a tourist, so to say. Then, by connecting these facts, these perceptions, in order to arrive at a figure, at an image, we have representations, patterns, as I call them in English. And by connecting patterns or representations, we get the different elements of the world getting involved with each other, arriving at behaviors, abstractions. And dimension 3 here, finally, it was Pierre Bourdieu, my old master, used to call habitus. Habitus is the grammar of our behavior, of our cultural behavior. In other words, children learning their mother tongue or their mother tongues generally don't learn rules, grammar rules, syntactic rules in a formal way. They just listen. They integrate the rules or the norms of their language so that they can develop their own narrative. Naturally, sometimes we could even say that parents, teachers, can correct them. You cannot say that way. But in general, and that is one of Chomsky's findings some 50 years ago, the grammar that we have in our brains, the grammar that allows us to develop a language, is combined with our skill or with the potential to develop language in 1, 2, 3, or 4 languages. That is interesting, because from a cultural standpoint, we have the same. Obviously, parents say, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Or you have to do this way. But in general, what we have in our habitus comes from our surrounding, our environment and culture. We have never heard that you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. just by watching people, imitating, emulating, but also adding our own creativity, because we will never find exactly the same situation our parents encountered before. We will tend to say, well, this is more or less what I saw 2 years, 3 years, 4 years ago. And we have a similar reaction. But it is not uncommon to find yourself in a cultural situation where there is no reference, there is no written rule to tell us how to behave. If we have the ability, the skill of habitus, the grammar of cultural behavior in our brain, we will be in a position to know what is likely adequate, what is likely acceptable, and then decide upon that. Decide whether we develop a certain behavior or not. We will be in a position to select a behavior. It is perfectly possible for us to do that. When we have an objective, when we have a goal for ourselves in trying to adapt to the environment, the important thing here is not to follow the rules. It's getting to know them. And the important thing comes now. I think this is a premise, a hypothesis. Individuals that speak 2, 3, 4, 5 languages make comparisons, make connections between the different languages to what I call dimension 4. This is what I call supralinguistic grammar. Obviously, that doesn't exist in writing or anything like that. But it is the understanding that there is something common to all the languages spoken by humankind. When a child or an adult starts learning a new language, the first thing they realize is the differences. And the differences are huge. They're important. I will not deny there are differences. There is a huge diversity in languages and cultures. This is part of the wealth of humankind. But then there are elements beyond that. Beyond differences, beyond diversity, we have common elements. In all the languages of humankind, it is possible to express ideas, to express feelings, to express emotions, etc., in one way or another. Naturally, that's part of culture. That means to say that we arrive at dimension 4, culture, a supercultural habitus. We understand if there is something common. With a little more time, I could give you so many examples to illustrate that. Some are very funny, like, for example, my students in Egypt, who asked me how to seduce a French woman. How do you do that? I don't know. I cannot explain it. So you've never seduced a French woman? Yeah, of course. Of course I have. Yeah, I have, but I can't explain. It is a type of cultural skill which is so advanced that I cannot explain. It took me about 2 weeks of work to find the way to explain it so that my student could understand and hide the lack of ability. It's like music. Some types of music force you to remain silent. You cannot explain it with words. You just get stunned with that music. Besides, human beings with this have the opportunity to access the metalinguistic conscience, the metacultural conscience, or cognition, which is dimension 4 in learning. And we can keep moving upwards. We can go to dimension N, metaphysics, the philosophy of language, the philosophy of culture. The important thing is not dimension 5 or dimension 6 or dimension 7, but rather the -1 dimension. Here, in language, this is what Chomsky, again, calls the universal grammar. That means the potential of every human brain to learn and develop language skills, learning 1, 2, 3 languages, whilst developing linguistic skills. Their potential, that is dimension -1. Dimension -1 in culture is the same thing. A sort of potential for the universal habitus, an infracultural habitus. I don't know the word in Spanish. Something that is wired. The connectivity or pre-connectivity in our brain, something that we all have to learn languages, to develop new cultural skills, the universal potential for learning, for understanding, for thinking. The potential we all have, something that is usually called synaptic connectivity, the amazing plasticity of the human brain. And obviously we have differences. Of course we have different cultures, we have different languages. So what? It's a good thing. But what we have in common as human beings, in our brains, perhaps is even more important than our differences. Despite what Samuel Huntington used to say, you've heard about this guy? The Clash of Civilizations? A warmonger. He inspired George W. Bush and other war criminals. Huntington, who was a professor at Harvard, stated it very clearly. You don't need to be very intelligent to teach at Harvard, by the way. We have criminals over there as well. He said that for any sort of individual, it is not possible for them to connect with a group that goes beyond their own culture. That is denying the possibility to identify yourselves, to relate yourself to a larger group, that would be humankind. And I say that that is a crime, because we do have that possibility. I still don't have the right word for dimension -1 in geometry. If there's any mathematicians in the room, I would love your help. The best known object in dimension 4 that we could use as an example is a tesseract. A tesseract is to a cube what a cube is to a square. It is a 4-dimensional object that obviously you cannot see, because we see in 3 dimensions, but we can imagine it. We can imagine what a tesseract is, and we can calculate things. Some people argue that tesseracts don't exist. Of course there are no tesseracts, but there are no circles either. In our world, Dimension 1 or Dimension 2 objects are just products of our analysis in our brains. You cannot see them. You can represent them. This is what matters. Another book published in 2012, unfortunately only in English in this case, only in English, I'm very sorry. I still don't have translations for that. The French have vetoed, they've censored the book, they don't want it translated because of political reasons, because what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is what we want for our children. In a large number of countries, I keep hearing, even in Japan, where they have a translation, the Japanese have been very honest. 3 more minutes, 4 more minutes? Thank you. The Japanese have said, as the British, as the French, as the Americans now, the North Americans, the gringos. If we want our young people to learn more, to learn better, when they learn languages, no, that's not true. That is simply not true. It is terrible to be a teacher, a language teacher, in a country where the feeling of superiority compared to other countries is so clear that they will never, ever gather their political support for children of that country to learn other languages. Why is that? Because when you learn other languages, you get in touch with other cultures. Children get in touch with other cultures and obviously become adults later on. By learning languages, they understand that there are differences, but there are common elements, and they are not superior. In those countries where they've had a history of colonization, for example, England, France, Japan, perhaps Spain, but I think the case for Spain would be different, and obviously the United States. The motivation to learn languages is very weak. Colonizers usually don't understand or don't learn the language of those they colonize. It's the other way around. As Voltaire used to say, the French, 250 years ago, the French are convinced that the Tower of Babel in the past would have been made impossible if they had also spoken French. Chapter 1. Well, he was very ironic when he said that. It's funny, I know, because it still holds true in France. And now, by way of conclusion, 2 children. This is about ethics in the brain. What is ethics in the brain? Do you know these 2 children? These are the adults. Gandhi and Himmler, 2 individuals at opposite extremes of an ethical scale. How come one baby becomes Gandhi? How comes another baby becomes Himmler? Where are the differences coming from? There are 3 options. It's only natural, because it's genetics. It's cultural, it's acquired through the environment, especially through education. Or 3, it is a combination of both factors. The third explanation is probably true because the brain is a continuous permanent combination of genetics and culture, genetics and the environment. But the third explanation is something that the media will not like. It is too complex and too complicated. The first 2 are easy, straightforward, easy to understand and to communicate. And then the media do not have the resources to talk about complexity, scientific or otherwise. And we are about to discover where differences come from. In ethics, in the human brain. This is what happens in neuroscientific laboratories throughout the world. What neuromyth we will have in place? If we found out about the biological mechanisms of ethics in the brain, that will modify dramatically our political, philosophical, educational conceptions, and even the perceptions we have about ourselves as a species. And there isn't anything like a neutral science. So, sorry, what happened there? Are human beings born unequal in terms of ethics? Or are ethical standards acquired later on, especially through education? I wouldn't have liked to be the teacher for Heinrich Himmler. If they had asked me in 1946 and 1947, what happened in your classroom with the little Heinrich? If we really want to promote empathy and respect, and obviously empathy between more than one culture, empathy between people from different cultures, we have hatred, we have empathy. Both of them exist. Both of them coexist. We need respect, and we need high ethical standards. We need to promote equity in education to start with. We must promote cognitive justice. What do we really want? Educating is humanizing. This is what Paulo Freire used to say, the great Brazilian educator, completely forgotten in so many countries, especially in the US. If you've ever read Paulo Freire, you will understand why. It is about learning to humanize individuals, to humanize societies, to develop our multiple intelligences. Individually, as Howard Gardner, my friend, says, developing our connective intelligences, giving our students the option to play an essential role in the co-building of knowledge, whilst developing our connective intelligence at a global level. I think that is possible, perfectly possible. I think we can connect all the magnificent brains we have in this room, not with direct synapses, of course, that's not how it works, but we have language. We have language to connect any type of language. Language can act as a synapsis between you and me, between all of you. There isn't a single brain in this room that is more powerful than all of the brains in this room connected at the same time. I'm sure of that. Opening up our building mechanism, that would be cognitive justice. Perhaps the future of this planet will rely on our capacity to open our minds to this new approach, a non-ethnocentric approach. This is a picture I took in Peru last year. Being cultivated is the only way to become free. This is the San Pedro Caraz University in the Andean range of mountains, a primary school. I like the quote. So everything I said and more is in one way or another included in an extraordinary novel called The Glasperspielen from Hermann Hesse. That's why he got the Nobel Literature Prize. Not easy reading for the summer when you go to the beach, but it's worth an effort, I can assure you. And by way of conclusion, an alumnus at Harvard, an extraordinary example, not just for literature, but also for medicine. Any type of justice there's no justice in life sometimes. He died when he was too young. After just one look, one glimpse into this planet, I agree with this. Any visitor from outer space would certainly say that. I want to see your manager, William Burroughs. I've never met him. But if I had had a chance, I would have said, Bill, I agree. But don't you think that we are the managers, at least partially?
I shouldn't wish people dogmatically to believe in any philosophy, not even mine. Si no está de acuerdo,
If you don't agree,
escribe, por favor.
write to me, and we can have a chat. If you agree, which is also right, write to me anyway. What I would like to see is this planet becoming the home of the rising brain, so that we play around with our brains together, so that we can empower ourselves, never forgetting the spiritual sense that we must have, but always remaining with our feet on the ground, because this is about making of this world a better place to live in. It is possible. I believe it. When I see what is happening around us, it is possible, I'm sure. Thank you very much indeed.